So thanks, Rick. I'm going to go ahead and kind of get started because we go through some introductory pieces, and as people continue to filter in, we can continue. And a lot of the messaging that I'm going to talk about is going to be very similar, I think, to a lot of the presentations that you're going to see through the next 2 days, and it really is about how we migrate, and I really do mean that word in the smoothest way possible, migrate from the way that we do things today or the way we thought we did things yesterday into where we need to go. And certainly you'll see this, you've seen this slide before already today. You'll probably see it again, and that is, the old days, the old way of doing things certainly are over. But as it relates to news production, that really is the focus, although you could certainly apply what I speak to today to other parts of production. Certainly in a simpler day, there was a news crew and they acquired content and then they produced it, and that content ran at very specific times on very specific channels. And the content, really just had that one destination, which was an RF, channel on a dial. And that staff was comprised of many, many very vertically oriented, single task-based specialists normally. But today, that's not the way things look. Certainly there are two trends that I'll speak to. And one is this concept of a journalist, or what does a journalist look like. Certainly for most of us in this room, that has changed significantly, particularly in the last 5 years, and probably this has been something that's been changing over the last 15, but certainly in the last 5, and that is that we have these less single task oriented journalists, and even journalists that are largely could be outside of your true legal entity or organization, including citizens who are creating content, whatever that content looks like, including full package stories. And then from that content that's being created, the second thing is it's no longer just being consumed at 6 and 11. Those, and it's not just being consumed on an RF channel. It's being consumed continuously during the day, and it's being consumed through a multitude of distribution methods. Certainly RF is still important to a lot of us, but there are certainly a lot of other things, including OVP platforms, online and otherwise. So if you mix those two things together, we get a very interesting chart. If we look at sources and destinations and see how those, all those things stack up, and what becomes, apparent very, very quickly, is how do we manage this? How is it that we decide what goes from the left side to what slot on the right-hand side? And my premise, my suggestion today would be that we already have a lot of the answer, and that is in the metadata of the content itself when it's created. And so really, this is my singular message really today, is that metadata is the key to surviving that job of mapping sources to destinations, these different pieces of media that we're creating, how we're going to map that in a reasonable way for an output. And if we look at a newsroom and we look at what we're creating in the newsroom, I mean, at the end of the day, beyond the video asset, journalism is creating, by definition, slews of metadata. And I have prepared a very interesting eye chart that hopefully none of you can read. But this is looking from the all the way at the left, from the video feed, archive, wires to the assignment desk. Into acquisition, field acquisition and editing, all the way to the right. Up at the top are the almost apparent and obvious pieces of metadata, which I know you can't read, but I'm sure that we can get you these slides if you really wanted to read them. But the point is there's already a significant amount of metadata that is captured by definition as part of the news gathering process, and news editing process. And much of that is certainly relevant in making decisions on how that content is distributed and whether it is in fact even legally to distribute it at multiple different points. And that becomes a key factor for a lot of us too. And do I, even though I'm a news gathering organization, do I have the rights? Sports is a good example of this, to use this on an online platform or not. And so I have another kind of historical slide. This is actually part of a presentation that was created over 10 years ago by Ed Kasasha and I as part of Grass Valley to look at how we could capture and retain metadata through a whole broadcast and online presentation workflow, and trying to, all the gray boxes, which I know again that you can't necessarily read, but you're just gonna have to trust me, and that these are places where metadata is captured and metadata should be retained and could be used to help drive those decisions on how content is distributed. So, we believe, and this is not just with Grass Valley, this is with most news editing platforms, that the data is already there to help make these decisions. Maybe not all the data, and so there are certainly some opportunities for us to help an organization and otherwise to make sure that those pieces are captured. But the whole point of this is we really do believe, and I think most of us in the room would say, that anything that we can do that would create rules-based, automating, a workflow, the things that we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, certainly in playout, and we've learned a lot in the playout space, and try to apply that more and more in the news space. And certainly if you look just at base automation, that's what we've been doing for the last 20 years. My friend David Workman over here and I, both, in this platform, certainly have been trying to apply, the types of things that we learned 20 years ago, and moving from a very manual master control process into an automated production platform. And there are a lot of similarities. Certainly there are some differences, but there's a lot of things that we can learn, and we can apply those same things, whether it's, and David will talk about redundancy later, but just in the production process itself, what is it that we can apply? And you look at this concept of the way the content comes in, and import rules, and how it gets, and whether it needs to be transcoded, and what are the endpoints, what are the different devices that it's going to need to be provided for. And a lot of that can be captured in these pieces of metadata, in this, what is the content, where did it come from, who might it interest, what are the demographics that are important, is this content that came from another news gathering organization and that we're just a partner with, and so what are our rights availabilities on this content? But in using as much of that data as possible to be as automatic as possible and take some of the workload off of that journalist, again, that, as I mentioned before, this is not just a person who has a very singular job, but has a very wide-ranging job moving forward. There is certainly a case for creating some custom metadata, and certainly, any platform that you look to deploy that you're trying to make, very specific decisions, and in often cases business decisions about how content is disseminated, there certainly needs the ability not just to be able to use the metadata that already is pre-existing, but to be able to create metadata that is very specific. Is this a piece of metadata that's embargoed? Is this a piece of metadata that has a particular shelf life? Is this a piece of metadata that needs to be superseded? Or data, the content itself needs to be superseded? Is that a metadata capture point? But certainly as content is captured more and more electronically in most field cameras, or with a handy mobile device, there is metadata inside that .mov or otherwise that can be used for a lot of good historical information that can be then mapped in a very reasonable and standard way. And there are lots of tools available, either from vendors that are in this room and outside, certainly, in trying to be and provide you a way to map that in a very, very reasonable way. And one, and I would be a little bit scared in front of a group from SMPTE to necessarily use the word standard in a callous or a reckless way, because standard for a lot of people means different things to different people. But there are some rule sets, there are some strategies. XSLT is one of those, where it does make it much more open, much more portable, much more available to multiple different operators to be able to provide the types of rules to map that metadata in a very seamless way. And that is certainly the methodology that my company has approached in doing this, and has deployed some tool sets to really create a For any of you who have ever imported context in or out of Outlook, a very drag and drop operation, and then to be able to save that as a set of map points so that then that metadata can be mapped automatically from there on after. And that is really the key, because what we're trying to do is reduce the workload, not create an extra workload point every time a piece of content is created. So, if we look at in the concept that we'll call, really digital publishing, what we really are talking about is having the content that we're creating anyway for a linear stream and being able to use that in multiple different ways. And in this case, I'm proposing basically 3 different types of use. And one is this concept of digital first, and that is I'm creating a package, a news package, a fully encapsulated package, and want to be able to publish that immediately to an online platform before it necessarily ever goes to air, so to speak. So that is certainly one concept. And in this particular case, we're looking at a finished piece of media that needs to be transcoded and needs to be sent out to a CMS for publication. But in addition to that, I can't just, as has been mentioned before, I can't just throw that piece of video out there anymore. Captioning, needs to be part of that process as well. And certainly other metadata would be useful to that as it relates to composing the image on the page. The more that I can do that in an automatic way, certainly there is text that's already in the newsroom computer system that could be captured and presented at the same time and pushed to that external hosting platform. And then beyond that, are there any regulatory issues? What are the other pieces of metadata that might be able to say, is this content that even can be produced on the website or not? And so those are and certainly on top of that, what are the ramifications of ad insertion? Is this a particular story? And I have some personal experience with a customer of ours who broke a story about Ford Motor Company and some issues, and unfortunately for them, had Ford spots run right in the middle, right after that break, which didn't work really well. So what are some rules that we can set up so that we can not create a significant business event for us in how we produce news? So, but all of those pieces, I would argue, and having been a journalist in a former life, I don't think the journalist should have to focus on those piece of items. Now, certainly they play a part in making sure that data is captured at the point of creation and the point of editing, but certainly in making these rules, what can we do to take the complication out and, basically build the machine around them and hide that level of complexity, because certainly complexity is not something that we want to introduce to users any more than we already have. A lot of what we're trying to do is allow journalists and others to focus on the creative process. I think that's all of our goals, and certainly if you look at SMPTE as an organization and otherwise, is what we're trying to do is not get in the way of the creative process, but to allow the creative process to happen. So, it is, trying to, pull the metadata that, or not necessarily even pull the metadata, but continue to present the metadata that already exists to enable this workflow to happen, so that the production staff really just needs to know this one thing. Yes, I want to send this piece of content to our in-house branded iOS app. I know that that's a destination, or even better than that, I know because of the topic or because of the metadata that was already in the system, or know that specifically it's allowed and that this does not need to be embargoed, that it can go automatically. The second use case is live simulcast, and certainly, there are many more station groups who are actually embracing this concept of not having their content only go through their RF or other distribution, whether it's an MSO, cable, or satellite operator, but also particularly on newscasts where they own the content, being able to simulcast live to the web. And there's also this concept of what we'll call as aired news, where live simulcast would be the full stream, so the 30-minute or 60-minute in its full entirety. As aired news really is this concept of taking the pieces. So an individual package would be a good example, but instead of just showing the package, as I presented in the first case, but being able to wrap all the other portions of the on-air presentation as part of that. And that's really where I want to spend just a little bit more time today and speak about some potential concepts of how we see that being rolled out. And certainly there's a manual way to do that, and there are many stations who employ this today, where literally they are taking a line feed coming out of the production switcher, recording that onto, hopefully not a tape, but I know that there are some organizations who do still do that. And then, literally, taking that and cutting that out, marking in, marking out at the beginning of the slug and at the end of the slug, and then, going back through and, cutting that up and creating subclips and then publishing those subclips. Well, for most of us in the room that have produced news or are producing news, we're doing that with the help of a newsroom computer system that already knows where all those events are. It knows where those points are in the timeline. So, and especially those that are using any type of automation, well, those segmentation points are well known and well controlled today. So instead of having someone after the fact doing that level of control, we already have all these pieces of metadata that we can use. We already have these segmentation points. Why don't we use those to automate that process? So again, this as aired, telling the whole story. So there's the individual package itself, but there's an introduction. There may be an over-the-shoulder. There may be, in this case, a split feed, so a double box for a live portion of the presentation, and then a tag. Being able to present that as a whole piece onto the online platform as a VOD asset after the fact. So, could we use then the content management system to create a template that then can create, be part of an event of that story. And so then when it's automatically created, it's just another trigger. So instead of triggering the live presentation, it's also, triggering, in this case, a record event, automatically on the server. It's looking at the segmentation marks that it already knows because someone hit the take bar on the automation system on when the event started, what the event ended. And because there is metadata in that content, hopefully when it was created, about what the story is about, when it happened, who was involved, whether it was a sports event, whether it was specifically something like Major League Baseball that may or may not be embargoed for online use, then that whole process, that push to that VOD platform, can be completely automated. And certainly there's a live event itself that could also happen, but again, those pieces happen as part of the flow that's already operating. Our message to the production community as well as others is we're already doing all of this work. We already have all these facts. We already have all this metadata. We already have all these decision points. We don't need to add any more to that in order to reuse a lot of this content in an interesting way. And certainly as a case of online production or online specifically distribution, there are certainly cases where that output, in this particular case, I'm suggesting that there are a couple pieces of data that may not be representative or may not be able to be used online. So having rules preset, so that I can substitute that content with either evergreen or other more appropriate content, perhaps that happened previously in the news day, replace those segments, including ad insertion, again, based on content that we already know about the preceding and succeeding content being used. So, my message again really is that metadata for us is what we think makes the workflow, and we use those terms. We're trying to get that work product, that production product, out to the market as quickly as possible. And certainly my really ending statement to all of us, and certainly in working with the standards body, is to work through, and this was mentioned earlier, this all works great as long as there's connectivity in the path and that the metadata doesn't get lost. And certainly there is work being done in committees and otherwise to make sure that whether you're talking about an ingest product or even a field capture product, that there is not just the capability to map the metadata, but literally not to lose the metadata along the production path itself. So, I would continue to ask that we work together, certainly as customers and providers, and certainly as standards bodies, to make sure that there are those paths, because my end comment is we have a lot of the data to make these decisions today. The question is, are we doing the right things in order that data stays and maintains throughout the whole production process so that it can be used in a very effective ways like this? So that is really the whole of my presentation. I'd be happy for, we've got about 5 minutes. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to entertain those.